Hello and welcome to the Everything is Black and White podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Musgrove, and it's the first of three end of season reviews. Later in the month, we'll hear from Lee Ryder and John Gibson. First off, I'm joined by football editor Mark Douglas, and we're going to go through what was an eventful campaign for Newcastle United. Plenty of downs, less ups, but it finished on a high. And Mark and I are going to discuss the season, go through a few key points, and I've asked him to pick out 5 or 6 players and moments as well that stood out for him. We'll get into them later on. We've also got a few questions as well from our listeners, which I'll ask Mark as well towards the end of the show. Mark, just to start then, I mean, Newcastle finished 12th, 45 points. It wasn't as easy as maybe that table suggests it was. Just sum up the season for you.
I mean, just an odd season, really. I think is the top line because, like you said, 12th in the league sounds fairly middling, but it's been a lot of lows and some highs at the end of the season as well. So I think a really difficult season to kind of to really interpret. Have they moved forward? Is the question that you would kind of ask as the big sort of overarching thing. And I would say no, but at the end of the season there were signs that they were starting to come up with a strategy that might move them forward. I think the biggest thing for me has just been everything is kind of overshadowed by this huge kind of behemoth of the takeover, which everybody's kind of talked about non-stop really since the season started, because it was, it's not been allowed to die by Mike Ashley and by the people who are trying to buy it as well. And that still dominates everybody's thoughts. So it was really only when things started to go drastically wrong around kind of in February, March, we really started to take much notice of the football apart from on actual match days. And it was really then, before then, it was just all about like what's happening with the takeover, all these kind of bombshells that were kind of dropped through club statements and sort of legal notices that went through. That was kind of the defining thing of the season until it got to the point where you were like, hold on, they could go down, and that means the whole of that takeover stuff is pointless. And then really the end of the season, the back end of the season, the focus has been on football. But I feel it's been, for me personally, a miserable season. I've not been to any games. I feel like the atmosphere around the club is increasingly toxic. I feel that there's a real antipathy from some people at the club towards elements outside the club. Let's put it that way. And what should be a unified United Football Club is fragmented, and that's a real disappointment. The one positive that I've got is that the team really did pull it out of the bag, march onwards, and there was some really interesting and exciting football to watch. But the problem is that is still then you kind of enjoy the game, and then within about an hour of kickoff, you've got the same voices telling you, oh, hold on, this is why you were all wrong about what you were saying, this is why Mike Ashley's great and all this. And that, unfortunately, is kind of like the cycle that we have around Newcastle United now. I think that just, unfortunately, has just been exacerbated by what's happened this season and through the season. It's almost like people can't judge what's going on by the merits of what's actually going on. It's got to be, well, this proves me right about Steve Bruce, or this proves me right about how bad he is or how good he is. And I think that's felt difficult and wearing at times. And maybe if we had actual football to go to, fans, the media, everybody, it might have been different. But it's felt difficult, I think. And roll on next season and hopefully some answers to the big questions that we've got around the future of the club.
Yeah, there's plenty of those, isn't there, to be asked. The start of the season, Mark, it didn't start too badly. I mean, the first 11, 12 games, they picked up something like 17 points, and that's a decent return for a Newcastle squad who probably were or are still lacking maybe 1 or 2 players. They certainly didn't have Joe Willock at the start of the season. So it looked like there was something to build on, and then it did just fall apart, especially towards from like November time when we had the EFL Trophy Cup, not the trophy, sorry, quarter-final against Brentford, where they just didn't turn up. And that was a real moment for Newcastle to get a step into the semi-final and give fans some hope that long wait for a trophy was finally going to be over. What do you think went wrong from that decent enough start to the point, at the turn of the year when things, had gone badly and then that only got worse from there on?
Well, I think the COVID outbreak training ground was pretty significant. It tipped over. I think you kind of say it was a good start, and it was in terms of points, but I think let's not forget there was some dreadful performances in that time. I mean, they picked up a point at Spurs playing, anti-football. I think even some of Steve Bruce's kind of advocates admitted that when they went to, say, Wolves, I think it was kind of, at the start of the winter, I don't know how they got a point there. It was dreadful. I mean, the Newport game was embarrassing how bad they were in that game and how pathetic really the setup and the attitude of the team and the way that they played that game was absolutely dreadful. But they were picking up points, and that was where you kind of had this disconnect between. I think people at that point were just getting fed up with everything because they were like, it's not fun to watch, but we're not going to get relegated. There's nothing to really to kind of talk about or those kind of things. And I think what happened when they had the COVID outbreak, it basically robbed the team of one or two really key players. And also it meant that one of the things that Newcastle had, which was their stamina and their ability to stay in games, they lost because a lot of those players who'd maybe not had a bad case of COVID, but they weren't at the same level. I mean, we remember the pictures of them after, I think it was at Aston Villa, where 3 or 4 players bent double, looking like they're absolutely exhausted from the exertion of that game. So I think it was a very fine margin that they were doing okay before then. And that fine margin was totally and utterly wiped out around Christmas. There was clearly 1 or 2 players in there as well who had the reservations about the manager and about the way they were being asked to play. And I think as well, some of the things that he was saying in public, they really didn't like either. So there was maybe a little bit of that all curdling. When the results started to go against them, it all felt like the walls were closing in because we had Brentford and then Sheffield United, which wasn't that many weeks afterwards. You had Leeds away, where people forget that was in the middle of a half-decent run of form, but that was a dreadful, dreadful defeat as well, 5-2, and could have been 8 or 9. They were absolutely battered that day. So there were enough signs, I think, before then that things weren't going right. And I think the problem was simply that the way that they were trying to play it was Steve Bruce had basically copied Rafa Benitez's tactics effectively, and just sort of tried to keep them playing the way that they were. And but he doesn't have the same attention to detail from a coaching level that they did then. And it was just, they've been playing out of kind of muscle memory, I think, for a long time then. And it just all went wrong. And I think you started to see, it only took 1 or 2 things to go wrong for them to be in the situation they were around Christmas. It looked like at Christmas they needed 2 or 3 players to come in, but you've got to remember that the league table never looked that bad for them right until the date I think we'll go on to later on when they drew with West Brom, when it looked like Fulham potentially could have overtaken them that day. But before then, despite the fact that they didn't go on a very good run, they never dropped into the bottom 3 all season. But they looked all right. It was never a situation where you felt like it was almost a situation where, look, if you don't make a change, we could go into relegation trouble, rather than them ever being in relegation trouble. And I think that was something that really helped them, because I think if they had have at that point got into the relegation zone and been 3, 4, 5 points away and had to chase like Steve McLaren's team did, like Rafa Benitez's team did, I think they would have been in big trouble. But they never did that, because they got, like you said, they found a way of picking up points. So, they were in trouble at Christmas, but they were never, or after Christmas, but they were never, they'd started to, they'd started to lose their way, but they were still had a nice cushion to the bottom 3. And that cushion, I think, meant that you never had the sort of panic stations maybe that you had, and the sort of lack of morale that you had in the Shearer relegation, the Benitez relegation, and the McLaren relegation.
One of the biggest frustrations for me was when you look back at November, Newcastle beat Everton 2-1, really good performance, against Palace and against West Brom. There were kind of moments in which you were hoping Newcastle would just build on and take some momentum. But I mean, they were fortunate to get all 3 points against West Brom. It took a superb Dwight Gale header, and that was the last win that Newcastle had. That win against West Brom, December the 12th, all the way to 30th of January. And it was just frustrating that they failed to really build on that performance, because the next game was against Leeds, then Fulham, and you would think, well, they could potentially get 4 wins in a row. Then obviously they lost to Leeds due to Fulham, which I thought was disgraceful when you're down to 10 men, when you're playing 10 men. And you were fortunate to get a point, I thought, because Fulham were excellent that day. They were unfortunate to actually go down to 10 men. And that was one of the frustrations, that they just didn't build on it. You mentioned there the cushion, Mark. Do you think that the fact that Fulham started so badly and didn't really start finding their form till very late on into the season, and obviously they beat Liverpool, didn't they? And then they just failed to pick up any more points really after that. How much do Newcastle have to thank Fulham, for being rather poor for 3/4 of the season, and that's resulted in Newcastle maybe staying up, or at least giving them a hand to staying up?
I don't think. I think Newcastle did it themselves in the end, because they let's not forget that after after the Brighton defeat, and to be fair, before the Brighton game, Brighton game was dreadful. The run, I think now you look back in context, actually they'd beaten. I thought the day that I felt they might end up regretting was the Palace game, where they played really well at home but lost because they were careless at the back. But you've got to remember, like, they had, they'd beaten Southampton, hadn't they, in that sort of epic game that would have been brilliant with fans in there. They'd beaten Everton, like you said, and then they beat, I can't remember who they beat before Palace, but there was Southampton came before Palace, didn't it? And so it felt like, had they started to move in the right direction, then you had Brighton, which was just this epic low, which was the worst performance of the season, I think, and there were a few contenders for that. But I think, so in the end, they did do it themselves. But you can't, it wasn't just Fulham weren't very good. West Brom were atrocious as well. Sheffield United were dead and buried by the time you got to kind of, February. They were gone. They were gone by January, really. I think they were gone maybe even earlier than that. But West Brom weren't putting any pressure on anybody. The season that Newcastle actually ended up going down with McLaren there, you had Sunderland, you had Norwich were sort of pushing that season as well. It was only Villa who were dead and buried, whereas the three teams that went down this season were just, you could tell they were going to go down. So I think, it just created a different atmosphere around the club. Now, I will give them credit, the hierarchy credit for not panicking, and because they said originally, like, the reason that they didn't sack Bruce was because they said they did sack McLaren. It didn't make any difference. They sacked before Shearer got the job. They made changes then, didn't they? And they sacked him. They made the changes then, and it didn't make any difference. So I think, and then they said Carver, when they brought Carver in, they didn't change him, and they stayed up. So that was kind of their attitude. But definitely, it created a different dynamic. The pressure was never on them in the same way that it has been in the previous times that they got relegated. So it did play a part. And I think, when you look at next season, if they find themselves in a similar situation, you potentially, who's coming up? Norwich. I mean, Brentford will possibly come up as well. But you've got Watford, who have got Premier League experience. So you might think it might be different next season, because Norwich, you would think, possibly could be, better for their experience than last time. But I think you'd be hard pressed to find a season where you don't need to get 30 points to stay in the Premier League. I mean, that effectively is what happened this season. And I don't remember any seasons where there's been no challenge from the bottom three. You knew the bottom three were going to go down, and it made it easier for Newcastle. But I think it's unfair to say that Fulham, made Newcastle season, because Newcastle ended up on a good number of points, really, for a team that were in relegation trouble. The problem for me with the Newcastle season is that it's been reinvented as a great season because they came back in those last 8 games. But if you take it as a whole season, 12th is not really progress, and they got players, I think, who could be better than 12th. But that's sort of probably, the way if they'd have had a really good season, they'd ended with those defeats and everything, it would have been a totally different narrative. But now you can see Bruce sort of saying, our critics should, have humble pie, and his son coming out very strongly and saying, we finished 12th, and this, that, and the other. And it's like, I find that's an attitude to have, but on one hand, I would say they've underachieved a bit this season. The end of the season, I think, has shown with the right players, they are a decent side, and potentially a top half side.
One thing that also stood out, Mark, was they seemed to get results, especially during that poor run, when the pressure was really on. I mean, you look at that win at Goodison Park, 2-0 on the 30th of January. I mean, they'd lost, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in a row. They hadn't won, actually, since the 12th of December. And they went out against Everton and played well and got the 3 points. It was on the back of that Leeds United defeat at St James's Park. So the pressure was really up there. And then after the Brighton game, to go down to welcome Spurs to St James's Park and get a point, and then they go on what's been a decent end to the season. They seem to just, I think, when the pressure really got to the top level, they seem to stand up and be counted. And I think credit to the players for maybe not listening to the criticism, maybe not letting it get to them, and just digging in and getting the points when it mattered.
Yeah, absolutely, and credit to Bruce as well for managing to galvanise the squad. And I think even his biggest critic would say it looked like it was all over after Brighton. We had the stories that came out and what's up on the training ground, those kind of things. Those look like the actions of a team and a club that are in big trouble. But actually, probably scratch beneath the surface, you've got a good group that's been put together by previous manager as well and added to by this one. But it's a group that gets a lot of stick. But actually, its core is a hard-working group. You've got Richie, you've got Dubravka, you've got Callum Wilson, you've got players, honest players, good players who didn't down tools. And I think that the message that came from the hierarchy, it was a high-risk one, and we sort of criticised it at the time because we felt Bruce should have gone. But it was a high-risk strategy to stick with him. That's what they did. And you have to say that was the right way to galvanise the squad. They basically said, you lot are not going to get rid of this manager. The elements of the squad who maybe did want him to move on. And I think, you have to say there probably would be one or two in there who did want him to go. But they said, that's not going to happen. You are not going to push us about. He's going to be there. You're going to have a relegation on your CV as well. And I think that probably the waverers, the one or two who were like, I'm not sure what's going on here, were galvanised by it as well. So they did, I think you have to say in the sort of pantheon of good decisions that the hierarchy have made, that's up there because it saved them this season. And I totally acknowledge that. It wouldn't have been what I would have done, but it was the right decision. It was the right call. And that, I think, you have to give them credit for that. You also have to give the players credit. But I think what you saw, you mentioned the Everton game. That was Callum Wilson's day. He was brilliant that day. And that is what you get when you buy a player as good as him. And we all said at the start of the season, this is a massive signing for Newcastle. Callum Wilson is such a player that it will change the season. It will give them so much. And that is exactly what happened because they went to Everton. And when you've got Callum Wilson playing up front rather than a Joelinton who's still learning the Premier League, you've got Callum Wilson there who terrorises defences. You are going to have a chance of winning games. And that's what happened, and then when they got Joe Willock in at the end of the season as well, they had 3 or 4 players who could cause opposition teams trouble, and that's what they did. So credit to the team, definitely. Will it be enough to kind of keep them going on the same route next season? I think that's the big question and the unanswerable question. And I think that if Joe Willock doesn't come in and they don't replace him with somebody who's got similar attributes, we've just seen Samari go to Leicester, who's a player who I think would have been fantastic for Newcastle. That's the big question, isn't it? Will they just let it all fall back again? And that's what you worry, isn't it? Because that's Newcastle's kind of modus operandi. But let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say that maybe there's a chance for something to build here.
I mean, it was ironic because after that, the Everton game at St James's Park, wasn't it, that Wilson got injured, didn't he? Went off. So
I think a couple of games after, wasn't it? Southampton.
It was Southampton game, wasn't it? Yeah, sorry. And we, like you say, we saw the best of Wilson in that run, and then he got injured, and then we saw just how much he matters to Newcastle because they effectively, other than really Joe Willock, lost that goal threat because Joelinton isn't that number 9 that has that instinct. Dwight Gale, for some reason, just didn't get a look in. He played against Chelsea, but he just didn't suit that formation. I mean, Callum Wilson is, key to this Newcastle side going forward, but they also do need someone, don't they, Mark, this summer to come in and who's capable of not only, pushing Callum Wilson and competing with him, but also capable of even maybe getting him out of the team and starting himself.
Yeah, and I think what they need is somebody, you mentioned Dwight Gale there. Well, we've still not had the official confirmation of the 3-year contract, which we understand he has signed, but towards the end of the season, he didn't get in the team. And not just that, when he did get in the team, he missed some big chances, and you're sort of thinking, could they have just re-signed him in order to protect the value that he may have if they sell him? Because I think that to me still feels like something that might have happened there, is that they might have just said, yeah, we've re-signed him, and we might end up getting sold, because it doesn't feel to me as if there's much of a chance of him playing a long role unless they like I said, that they are desperate and they basically need to play him. But yeah, they do need a striker. I mean, we've heard that they're after this young lad at Wigan, Kyle Joseph, who could play in the first team as well. They're going to need one if Andy Carroll goes, because they will. I know Carroll hasn't played much either, but you can't go through a season with just Wilson, Gale, and Joelinton. Despite the fact Joelinton's getting better, I don't think he's ever going to be a 15-goal season man. But they're going to need somebody, aren't they? And it seems like if they do have the resources, those resources will probably be channeled on Joe Willock. So will they end up trying to bring in somebody on loan? I mean, I know Bruce is a massive fan of Tammy Abraham, but is that realistic? I mean, Chelsea are going to ask for a lot of money for him. So they do need a striker. Yeah, they definitely do need a striker. The goals, like you said, Wilson will score goals. He's missed a few games this season. He missed a few for Bournemouth as well. So we are in a situation where, is he going to do you a full season? Well, he hasn't this season. I think generally speaking, he's got, his injury record's been kind of hit and miss. And that's probably why he's not on a top 4 club. Because in my opinion, he's good enough to play for those top elite tier teams. He's brilliant. I mean, I love watching him play. He's quick, strong, he can finish. He's got the right attitude. If he'd been fit all this season, I think he would have played. I think he would be in with a shout for the England squad for the Euros. I think he's that good. But that's just the situation. You're going to have to, like you said, you need that backup, and they just haven't got that backup at the moment.
Got a few points here from throughout the season that we'll get your view on, Mark. We've got, first of all, the arrival of Graham Jones. I just want to get your point on how important that was, and if you think he has made the difference that has seen Newcastle, pick up form and ultimately, stay in the Premier League.
Yeah, I think so. I think Jones's appointment was a key moment. Very strange way of announcing it, because it was almost announced as if you've got a new manager. They had a picture of him in the boardroom with the shirts behind him, and obviously didn't get in. He's never been interviewed by independent media, but that's Premier League these days. Definitely Newcastle. They wouldn't put Graham Jones up because it should be a great story. It's an easy story, isn't it, for them to publicise, but they chose not to do it. But yeah, I think what I think is clear is that they needed a fresh voice in there. They needed somebody new. Bruce isn't. I think he's a coach, but his skills probably lie elsewhere. The man management side of it, the sort of absorbing the pressure a little bit, being a senior man, being experienced. But coaching wise, I think Clements and Agnew were doing quite a lot of that. I think he needed somebody new in, and Jones came in. They immediately started playing a different way. They've adapted a little bit attacking wise. The players like him. I think it depends who you talk to about whether Bruce had final say in that. I think Bruce adamant that he did, and it was his call. But I think that's one that's open for interpretation. But he's clearly not been scared of working. He's not. If it wasn't him, and as I said, there's been no suggestion to me that it wasn't him, but that has been suggested elsewhere. If it wasn't him who appointed him, that he has worked happily with him. I don't think there's been a sort of feeling of resentment towards that. And Jones has done really well. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because his last posting was at Luton, where he's manager, and Rob Lee, I think, was a little bit scathing towards him on Twitter. But actually, he's ended the season going with England to the Euros and turned, I think, Newcastle. He's definitely had a say in how Newcastle changed. I don't like the idea that you take it all off Bruce, because we did give Bruce a lot of criticism when things weren't going well. And I think it's really unfair then take all the credit away from him when things are going well and say it's all Graham Jones because they're doing well. The reality on the training ground is that Jones has got an input, a big input, but he isn't the manager. He hasn't been making the selection calls. He has been devising systems and strategies and things. So give him credit for that. But yeah, big appointment. And yeah, really good to see a local coach end the season. Part of the England setup. I mean, he was well known to Southgate, I think, before he got the job, and Southgate knows the Newcastle hierarchy quite well. But yeah, I mean, I think it has been a big turning point. Could have gone either way, but it's actually gone well. And I think I have to be honest. If Bruce does go and the current hierarchy are there, I think it will be Jones who will probably get the nod as the next manager.
That was talked about, wasn't it, when the pressure was really on after that Brighton game. The other big point towards, in the new year was the Matt Ritchie incident, the bust up on the training ground of a bit of shoulder barging and swearing and what have you. We all know Matt Ritchie. We've both been in the press box when he's been injured and sitting behind us, and we've heard him kind of kicking every ball and shouting when things don't go right on the pitch. So we all know he's this fiery character. I love it. I think it's absolutely brilliant. I think he sets the bar. How important of a role in the upturn in form do you think that moment on the training pitch had?
Well, probably despite what they may have reinvented it as, it wasn't something that you would want to happen. I think it's been a key moment because what happened after that and the way it was reported was that you clearly got a backlash from the Bruce loyalists in the dressing room against the way that was portrayed as, being a negative. I thought that was, it wasn't good. It however you kind of say, it wasn't good, but it did say something about the character of both men that effectively, he was brought back in, and whether they still like each other now or not, they've formulated a really good working relationship because he's playing. I like Matt Ritchie. I think he's played really well. I think it's funny because I think when he was about to be sold in January, a lot of Newcastle fans would have said, is it the worst thing in the world if it means we've got some money? But now you'd say if he went this summer, you'd say no. We need to keep him. So he's played really well. I mean, his delivery was absolutely fantastic. Some of the goals that he scored in the final games as well. I mean, as a dead ball man, I don't think enough's made of just how good his free kicks were and his corners were at the end of the season. That is against Leicester, absolutely superb. Against Man City, really good as well. That's a weapon. I don't think it's sometimes seen as how important it is to have somebody who's good at corners and good at free kicks. And Ritchie is that. Plus, he's this kind of combustible character who drives you on. It's really nice. I mean, it's become a kind of like a little bit of a meme, hasn't it? Looking at how he reacts when the team score or when the team are fouled, you can see him jumping. He heads every ball. He does all these things. I just think he's a good character to have. And another one that, he was signed by Rafa Benitez to get them back out in the Championship because of his good attitude. And, and you have to channel players like that because Newcastle aren't a good enough team to be able to just do it through sheer quality. They need somebody who's really knocking on the door in terms of their attitude and application as well. So yeah, I mean, I really hope he stays. He's got a long-term contract. It wasn't good what happened. There's no doubt. I mean, it was portrayed as, this happens all the time. But that kind of thing is relatively rare, that confrontational. But they buried it and moved on. And I think, you have to, again, give credit to Bruce. I'm giving a lot of credit to Steve Bruce for a man who I was calling to go after Brighton. But
deserved, isn't it? Because he's turned it around at the end of the season. But I think, as we've alluded to here, and we've both written and tweeted out at various points in the past few weeks, it is about the bigger picture, and we'll get onto that with a final question later on in the show about what happens next. But it is about the bigger picture, about getting that balance. He was criticised when it was right to do so, and now he's getting the praise. But it's not a clean slate. But we'll get on that into a moment. Just on Matt Ritchie, finished the season with 105 crosses. That was Newcastle's highest. And it was noticeable straight away as soon as he came back into the side that there were more balls going into the box because, the players who were playing instead of him, Jamal Lewis, they didn't have that delivery or that desire to get the ball in. So Matt Ritchie has made a massive change to Newcastle's season. And just finally, Mark, the other big talking point, I guess, was the arrival of Joe Willock and his impact, especially in the last month or so, where he's just gone on this fantastic goal scoring run, 7 goals in 7 games. We all want to see him back. What a signing that has been.
Yeah, they've got a good record actually of January loan signings. Newcastle, Kennedy Dubravka was originally a loan signing. You've got going back to Loic Remy and Salomon Rondon, who obviously full season loans. But yeah, really good signing. I'd actually seen him play a couple of times in the Europa League for Arsenal and thought he looked like a good player. It's funny because he looks quite. I mean, I think he looked in much better sort of, well, not better conditions is not the right word, but he looked like he had bigger frame when he came to Newcastle than when I saw him play than when I saw him play for Arsenal. When he was still quite wiry, and you sort of thought he still looked a little bit like a kid playing in a kind of men's team, but he was brilliant in a couple of Europa League games that I saw him play. He just looked dangerous. But then he's got to come into a team that was struggling a little bit in January, and you thought, is he the answer? They've gone for Samari, they've gone for other players in that role. They've gone for Hamza Chowdhury, who was going to be who was a slightly different style of player. But Willock, his attitude was fantastic. Everybody you spoke to said that the kid's attitude was really first rate, and it was nice that you had Ian Wright talking a little bit about being a mentor for Joe Willock. And I think what's nice is Ian Wright is a bit of a kind of he's got a bit of sympathy. He's got a bit of a soft spot for Newcastle now through his relationship with Alan Shearer. So it's weird, isn't it, how these things kind of work, that probably, all these good connections that kind of happened mean that Joe Willock came with probably knew what was expected of him very early on from Newcastle perspective. And what was great is that he was told, you are going to be our main man. At Arsenal, you're going to play 20 minutes here and there. You might get a chance league against one of the lower teams. If you don't play well, you're going to be out of the team. It wasn't the situation at Newcastle. You knew he was coming in and he was the main man, and he just thrived in it. Some players don't quite get to that level, but he just thrived in it. And towards the end, his confidence was so high. He looked like, Fulham were worried about him. You could see, and he's running with the ball's been fantastic. He's also, not since Kevin Nolan have they had a midfielder who plays like that. I mean, he really just seems to know where the goal is, and he's exactly what they needed. I love that game against Liverpool when he came off the bench and he looked dangerous. I love the fact that when he gets the ball, things happen, and he just has that direct route straight to goal. There's no worries for him, and he's happy to take. He's happy to take a shot from distance. He'll gamble on the runs, and I think that's what's nice about him. Is you get some midfielders, and I think it's something that Joelinton's been kind of accused of, isn't it? That you don't gamble sometimes. If you don't get in the box, you don't get in the right area, then you'll not score. Willock's done that, and the delivery's been good because Richie's been playing there, and Jacob Murphy, I think, has been an unsung hero this season as well. I think he's done really well. Nobody really talks about him, but quietly, I think he's been a really key player as well. His delivery's been really good, and I think what's been great for Willock is that he's probably profited from a team that were, everybody thought he's coming in, he's playing in a team that doesn't get much of the ball, doesn't attack much. Good luck trying to make that work. But actually, towards the end of the season, because the players know that he's going to be in there, they have gambled a little bit more. They've been encouraged by attack a little bit more, and it's just worked for him. And sometimes relationships between a player and a club just work. And I feel that if Newcastle can go and test Arsenal's resolve, Willock will push for this move. If he doesn't feel he can get a chance at Arsenal, what's the point in going back to Arsenal and playing one game in every 4? If you're Joe Willock, he's at the age where he needs to play. If he'd had the whole season at Newcastle scoring those kind of goals, I think he would have been in the England squad as well. So there you go. You don't want to sit on, okay, he's an Arsenal lad, and Arsenal are probably better placed than Newcastle to be, competing for trophies and being in the Champions League. But what's the point in being part of that if you're not playing?
You mentioned that Liverpool game there, the fact he was on the bench. I mean, some players might have sulked, he said I was going to be starting every game, but he didn't. His attitude was absolutely superb, and he was on the bench after scoring against Spurs, wasn't he? So I think many people expected him to start. He didn't, and that's another good thing about him. He's so young, but he seems to have this mature head on him. which is really good to see. And that's it. That's a good sign going forward in his career as a whole, let alone if he comes back to Newcastle. Hopefully he does. And we also mentioned there Jacob Murphy. He's had a great season. He would be my biggest kind of, well, he'd be my most improved player, actually. We'll get onto the list in just a moment. Just the other thing I want to mention about Willock is the Sheffield United game at home, 10,000 fans back in the stadium. Obviously, he scores. I do think that's going to play some kind of role in hopefully him coming back, because it's okay. You get the messages on Twitter, you get the messages on Instagram saying, Joe, yeah, we love you, come back and sign. But to feel that, and even though it was just 10,000 in the stadium, to feel that in person, that roar, that cheering, the singing, we want you to stay, the scenes that we saw when he came out in his car and he was signing the shirts and what have you, I think that'll play a big part, because it shows that, yeah, you know what, I'm coming to somewhere where I am loved and I am cared about, and the fans do want me to stay here.
Yeah, I do think it makes a difference. And you have to be cynical as well and say, you can use it as a platform. If Newcastle don't improve, look at what's happened with Alan Saint-Maximin. He's come in, he's had 3 years. He actually only played 49% of the minutes that he was that Newcastle had this season, but yet he's probably pushed his reputation up twice. I mean, if Alan Saint-Maximin was at Manchester United and playing 49% of the minutes, he'd be getting the kind of stick that Paul Pogba gets. But because he's at Newcastle, expectations are slightly lower, which, hey, we talk about expectations, but expectations on players are lower than they are at Arsenal, Man City, Man United. So players get forgiven a little more. So Joe Willock comes in, he has a bad spell. It doesn't matter as much as it does at Arsenal. He's not out of the team, maybe. Not that he'll think like that, but it's the idea that you're loved and the idea that you get that confidence from it. Every player would want to play there. And we're not talking about being loved at a team where they're getting 14,000 through the door. You're talking about being at a big club that's, where football means a lot, and to have that love means a lot. But it also means Newcastle is a big enough club where you do get paid attention to. Johan Cabaye was another example. These players would tell you that those moves make their career. Demba Ba went on to something bigger. Remy went on to play Champions League. The disappointment is that they can't. It doesn't happen with Newcastle at the moment. They might in the future if Newcastle get taken over or something else happens. So I think it will make a difference. His dad is very influential in the way that Willock makes decisions, and I think his dad is. They're a great family. There's another brother, Charles, obviously, who's I think he's at Benfica, isn't he? Or he was at Benfica. So they are, they're a really good. He's a good kid. From what you hear, his dad's not like going to be an agent who's just going to be looking for the next big payday. He's going to be trying to look after his career. You hear from Bruce that his dad's been absolutely delighted with the way that he's been treated the whole way through, and you think it might very well have a big impact on how he does. And if it doesn't, at the very worst, it is a selling point to other players next season to say, look, this is how you get treated at Newcastle United. But let's hope it's Joe Willock coming back for 25 million or whatever, and Newcastle have a absolute match winner in their book.
Yeah, 100%. The last few games, then, Mark, the last 14 games, in fact, Newcastle won 5, they drew 5, which was brilliant. A brilliant run they had. Steve Bruce, manager of the month for April. I didn't see it coming. I don't think many people saw it coming. The Manager of the Month award fully deserved, and it was great to see them playing with a bit of freedom. I don't know where it came from, but that's where Steve Bruce needs to be praised and his coaching staff, because whatever they did, they got it right, and they took Newcastle to safety.
Yeah, I mean, I saw. It's funny because I saw the bad run coming, because they, like I said, the results didn't match the performances, and then when after the Everton game and they got some players back, I did see a run coming. I maybe didn't see it against Tottenham, but they've got it in them, and there's something about Newcastle where maybe it's just a hangover from the Pardew era, but there was something about that where I felt it sort of mirrored that a little bit. So I was worried after Brighton, but when they had the result that they had against Tottenham, I thought this could be the start of something, because then they had a kind of winnable run of games, didn't they? They had Burnley next, was it? And I thought they'll go to Burnley and get something if they play the way they did there. Liverpool was a surprise, but and that was probably the most noteworthy result because Liverpool obviously didn't drop any points pretty much.
West Ham as well.
West Ham. I mean, West Ham was a really good performance.
Yeah.
But you felt West Ham, they had West Ham's number. They had Everton's number this season. Whereas Arsenal, weirdly, outplayed them 3 times. It was a very strange season. It's been really odd. The good thing that they had between, I mean, obviously everybody wanted fans in the ground, but in some ways it took a bit of pressure off them to play that Tottenham game without fans there, because I think Bruce would have been absolutely, would have been subject of a lot of criticism in that game. And it would have been, the pressure would have been on if they had have lost. Obviously, they conceded the goal. They were 2-1 down, weren't they? And I think the pressure would have been on. So in some ways, it helped them there. But then the momentum that they started to generate, then the crowd are with you. And you saw against Sheffield United, they didn't play well that day. But the crowd were great that day. They weren't impatient. And so, yeah, I mean, they do deserve praise. They do deserve praise. And they didn't pick up. They deserved the points that they got in that run. Or they didn't. It wasn't like they were lucky in too many of those games. They weren't actually. They deserved points. They would deserve the point against Tottenham. They deserved the point against Liverpool, I thought. Didn't get anything from Arsenal, didn't deserve it. But then, Leicester, they deserved that game. They deserved to win those games. So, maybe the one game where they probably didn't actually was Sheffield United. I thought Sheffield United more than enough.
Yeah, it was a bit
they
flat,
weren't.
I mean, obviously the Man City game as well. I think you hit the nail on the head there, Mark. It was just nice to be watching games in which you thought, oh, well, then Newcastle haven't just scraped a point, haven't just scraped a victory. They deserved it. And against City, yes, they lost 4-3. And yes, they only had they had 2 penalties and they didn't test them maybe as much as some other teams do. But they were still in the game. And it was nice to see them actually try and lay some punches on them. Whereas before in the season, we saw against Chelsea, it was like a training game, wasn't it? Way back, I think it was November. It's like a training game. It was embarrassing. I think many people switched off. So it was nice to see them go against the top sides and try and get something out of it. And that leads us on to the final question before I do get your kind of end of season player awards nominations. Steve Bruce, we've mentioned criticism, we've mentioned praise. Out of 10, how do you rate his season?
Good question. Probably 5. First part of the season 2, and then those last 9 games 7, 8. So it was terrible at the start. But I think it's a 5 because you sort of say the first part of the season, middling 4 or 5. That in between bit, maybe a 1 or even a 2, maybe a 2 or possibly even a 1 or a 0. They were that bad. And then the end of the season, really, really good. So I'm going to give him a 5. Might dock the point because I just feel, that there's been times when he's fully entitled to defend himself, Steve Bruce. But I feel that it has tipped into, some of the things, as somebody who's very seasoned manager, like I think some of the things that he's come out with have been unnecessarily set the tone for a kind of for negativity. But as I said, up to him how he reacts to the criticism that he's got. He would say that some of it's been really unfair. So that's up to him, isn't it? And he's obviously had his say at the end about the humble pie reference, and his son's obviously gone on Twitter and attacked a journalist who's criticised him, and that's up to them. Don't think it reflects particularly well on him doing that, and I don't think it necessarily needed the humble pie bit at the end. They finished 6th. They finished 12th. If they'd have finished in the top 10, fair enough. But he did say at the start of the season he wanted the top 10. They finished 12th. They didn't get relegated, but if they had got relegated, it would have been an absolute, utter, pitiful failure. And I think that was sort of shown by the end of the season. But like I said, we've given him credit, so there's a bit of criticism, as I think that, somebody should be having a word in his ear to say, don't say things like expectations. Don't go for, it's, there was ways that you could have don't in the moment when you're at a high, go on TalkSport and talk about fan expectation and lay into journalists, because just bask in the fact that everybody's acknowledging that you've done a decent job there. You know, you don't have to be kind of like trying to do what he was doing, which was like, yeah, look at me. It's just not necessary, really. But how it is, and it's set the tone, I think. And unfortunately, that's why I think a lot of fans aren't having him, because he thinks it's attacking the people who've attacked him, but actually it's the fans, I think, sometimes, who portray it as you're having a go at me because I've criticised you, and you're saying all my critics should eat humble pie. Well, actually, I'm one of the people who's had a go at you. So, it's the life of a football manager, isn't it? You've got a lot of credit. You've got a lot of credit for the last 8 games. So why not kind of accept that? I've never understood it. But there you go. What can you do?
Well, yeah, I'm still can't quite believe that TalkSport interview. But anyway, what I do want to ask you there, because you've mentioned it, how the fans weren't in the ground during that horrible run of form, and that's probably helped Newcastle in many ways. But let's say they're back in 52,000, fingers crossed, for the start of the season, then from there onwards. Do you think that puts a little bit more pressure on Steve Bruce? Because, say if he goes on even half as bad a run as he did at the turn of the year, that pressure is going to be unbearable, isn't it? I mean, it must be playing in his mind, and does it increase the the kind of the pressure on him in many ways from some sections anyway?
Yeah, I mean, it will do if I don't think it'll be 52,000, by the way. I think there'll be even when everybody's allowed in. I think, bear in mind, remember, one of the big talking points of the previous season was the amount of people who hadn't renewed their season tickets because of everything that happened. Add to that the takeover and the disappointment around there, and I don't think there will be 50,000, and I think it'll be fewer than that. It adds pressure, but I think he's bought himself some time. I think with 50,000 in there, or 45, or however many, there is a sort of good number who aren't probably that as critical, or maybe they feel disenchanted with what's happened, but they won't necessarily voice it while the team's playing. We've seen that before in quite with Newcastle, where there's been a lot of talk online about this man's the most hated person since XYZ, and then the team pull off a result, and there's no negativity towards them at all. So it just adds a different dynamic. I don't think we can predict Newcastle fans. I don't think that's ever been a possibility. I think we know general trends about how people are feeling, and we reran the Bruce survey, and that was pretty clear. I don't think we aren't going to run it this summer as well to say the same thing, but I would think that it wouldn't be a million miles away from where it was then, because I think a lot of people wouldn't want to change their mind. But I think if the team start, if they bring in Willock and maybe one or two others, and they start the season, I think it'll be a generally positive atmosphere and an accepting atmosphere. If they go through a run like they did last time, yeah, the pressure will be on. But I always said this with Bruce: as soon as they appointed him, it wouldn't take much for the negativity to start, because I don't think it was a really popular appointment. Fact is, in the first season, he never went through a bad enough run for that ever to be shown in the stadium. The second season, obviously, he did, but there was no fans in there. So if he goes through that kind of run, I think, yeah, there will be trouble there. But I think the players are there for them not to have to. They don't have to fight relegation next season. They shouldn't fight relegation next season. They've got a good enough squad not to.
Just before we get into your awards, then, Mark, we're going to have to mention the dreaded word of the takeover. Do you see any hope for fans that come the start of the new season, there will be new owners in the director's box?
Well, you can't write it off. I mean, we've got to the point where those kind of questions are impossible to answer, because they're going to be answered by, 8 or 9 lawyers in a glass room in London's legal district somewhere in about 6 or 7 weeks, because the arbitration will effectively decide where we go from here. And I think nobody knows where that's going to go. The fact is, if that goes for Newcastle, then there is a chance that takeover is going to happen. I think they will then move heaven and earth to try and make it happen. I still feel that there are some legal hurdles between that and then it actually happening, because there's still the questions of piracy and things like that to sort of go through. So I feel it's unlikely that they'll be under new management before the start of the season. But as for this takeover, I've always said, never say never. I think the problem is that the positive vibes that we've kind of been getting off so many people for so long are just that, positive vibes. Whether it means that things are actually going to change or not, I don't know. It's in a lot of people's interests for this takeover to go through who are involved in the deal, and I think it's probably in their interest that the thing keeps ticking along. What slightly worries me about the whole thing now is that if arbitration doesn't happen, if it doesn't work out, we know now where the next legal case is, the next legal battle is at this Court of Arbitration for Sport. That is going to be a long-term case. Judging by what the legal people tell us, the people who know about arbitration, what they tell us, is that could stretch into 2022. And for me, that is then another year in purgatory. And I feel like it would be better at that point to say, let's have a resolution. Let's either go and try and find somebody else to buy it, or take it off the market and Ashley acts like a proper owner. But I don't think that's what he's going to do. I think that he will see it as, I'll keep going and I'll keep trying to get to the point where the Saudis are actually going to take over, because he believes that is the right deal for Newcastle. But we now kind of know that is it's such a high stakes game, but nobody knows whether it's going to happen or not, and we just have to wait now and wait until some point in July or maybe early August where we find out what's going to happen. What frustrates me about it is it's all behind closed doors. That is, to me, for such an important decision, there should be some transparency. And to be fair to Ashley, he did try and get that, but it was defeated in the High Court.
Just on Ashley, we've seen other kind of chief executives come out. We've seen it with Villa this week. We've seen it with the Leeds chap. I think he was on Sky Sports, coming out and talking about the season, talking about what's going to happen this summer, talking about what the aims maybe are for the next season. And yet there's nothing from Newcastle yet. Would you expect there to be? I mean, communication's always been a big issue from the hierarchy, and I know it hasn't been a great season, but I think some fans, would like to see some sort of message, whether it's just saying, thank you for your support or whatever. The club would probably argue every time they put something out, they get a ton of abuse and criticism, so that's why we do them. But what's your take on it?
Well, I don't think they will, because I think they've shown with the takeover that they can do it, and they can do it well, because that's Ashley, isn't it? But I think in terms of detailed plans for the future, they haven't done that for such a long time. I think they sometimes feel that when it does happen, they get abused, like you said, and it gets held against them. But it's the right thing to do, to sort of communicate properly with supporters, and take a bit of heat off Steve Bruce as well. I think you're going to get the accounts coming in the next few days or weeks or whatever. And what the club have done in the past is brief journalists on the accounts. They didn't do it last year. I'm not sure whether they'll do it this year. Probably unlikely. But that, I think, will be a good point at which to sort of speak about the future of the club and what's happened. And I think they might do it then. I don't know whether they'll do it with any of the journalists who've been critical of Steve Bruce, but they might do it. And we'll get a bit more of an idea of where things stand. It might be one or two journalists who've kind of been supportive of them might get the nod for that one. And we'll see where things go. But for me, that would be the opportunity. And they did do it a few years ago, when Rafa Benitez was kind of obviously there was uncertainty about whether Rafa Benitez was going to stay, but they did do it then. And I think personally it gave us more of an insight into what the club was doing. It may not have been something if you'd agree with, it was the right thing to do. So yeah, I don't think there will be a statement of intent. We'll know soon enough, because we'll know whether they've got any money to spend or not, and so we'll kind of get an idea. But obviously last summer they actually did spend a bit of money, so the accounts will tell us a little bit about that as well.
On to then the kind of player awards for the season. We'll start with your star man in a sentence. We'll get you to name the person or the moment, because there's a few moments in here, and we'll get you to sum up in a sentence or so. So we'll start with your star man.
Willock. changed the season, great attitude, just exactly the kind of player that Newcastle United need in their squad. He only played half the season, but what half a season it was.
Your key moments?
My key moment was when Callum Wilson scored those 2 goals against Everton, because had the season gone, had they lost that one as well, I don't know where the season would have ended up going. And that one just beats Willock's goal against Spurs, which was absolutely massive. And you could even say, probably in third place, Lascelles' goal against Villa, because that was a massive, massive moment as well.
Yeah, huge that one was. The unsung hero?
Jacob Murphy. Been really good this season. Not really got a lot of credit, but scored some really key goals. Great attitude. Another great lad. And, I think becoming a really good Premier League player, you would hope that they exercise the clause they've got in his contract to keep him on.
I'll argue that, actually, because I once in a day wrote 3 stories in a row about Jacob Murphy, so I've been flying the flag. I would also just throw in, from my point of view, a shout there for Miggy, because I think he doesn't get enough praise. Yes, he needs to score more goals. Yes, he needs to provide a few more assists. But if you look at when Newcastle do counter really well, he's usually the first or second person on the ball, and he doesn't half carry it 25 yards or so to get other players involved. So I'll give a little shout there for Miggy. The most improved for you?
Jolinton. At the start of the season, I felt it was all over for him. Towards the end of the season, I felt he was unlucky not to be in the team. To be back on the bench. I think he's. I think we'd all love it. I think he's had so much criticism. We'd all love it if he came back next season and sort of picked up and he's got his 10 goals and started to do well. But I think the moment when you kind of feel like kids got a bit more confidence was when he scored that penalty. You felt that there he is. That's a player with a bit of confidence to step up against the Man City, and he played well. He played well in some of those games towards the end of the season as well. It was almost like there was a sympathy vote when he scored against Crystal Palace, but towards the end of the season, you were like, actually, he's playing quite well here. He's never going to be a Callum Wilson. He's never going to be a £40 million player, but he can be a Premier League player for Newcastle, and that's not something I would have said at the start of the season.
Yeah, fingers crossed he can build on what was a decent end to the season. And what have I said there? Yeah, sorry, this one's always a bit tough, isn't it? So the player who's underperformed the most.
Like you said, it's a difficult one, and there'll be loads of people shouting John Joe Shelby down the screen at me. But I have to say, look, I'm not writing him off in any way, and I'm not saying that the kid's been a bad signing. I think Jamal Lewis, given the expectations on him after he signed, probably the performances haven't quite matched that. But hopefully next season he will kick on. I think it's unlucky for him in a way, because Jetro Williams and Alan Saint-Maximin had a good relationship down that left flank. Jamal Lewis is a totally different kind of player. I would think Alan Saint-Maximin is a nightmare to play on the same flank as, in some ways, because it does make it difficult. But I feel bad saying that, because I don't want to hammer the kid at all. I don't want to hammer the lad at all, because he's I think he's been found potential and he's got a chance. But yeah, I was disappointed with his performances as opposed to what I was hoping he would do. But hopefully next season he'll bounce back and be a key man.
Fingers crossed. I mean, Steve Bruce spoke just before the end of the season, so he's still got a big future at Newcastle, and maybe he just needs to get John Beresford in or Robbie Elliott in to show him the ropes about how to deal with such an attacking player in front of him, because of course they had David Ginola, didn't they, to deal with. The biggest surprise, whether that be a player, whether that be a moment, whatever more, what's been the biggest surprise of the season?
The biggest surprise is probably the revival after Brighton. Just how improved they were, and how galvanized they were there, and I think not necessarily even the results, just the system and the strategy was so much better. They look like a different team. So that maybe is the biggest surprise. The other thing off the field, Ashley's attitude to the takeover, because I thought he would it would be very much behind closed doors, as we're not going to talk, but actually he's been all guns blazing, desperate for the takeover, and has actually probably done us a favour in some ways, because we've been hearing that that's what was happening by the people at PCP, and a lot of people had said to us, stop writing about it. But I think the way that he's reacted to all of that stuff has illustrated that, that is not dead, and that, it's still going. But so off the field, that'd be the biggest surprise. Some of those statements, the dark forces, all that kind of stuff, what is going on? But I can't speak for you.
And just finally from that section then, what's the key thing that has to happen this summer? I think I know what you're going to say, but what's the key thing that has to happen this summer?
Well, they've got to sign Willock, haven't they? And I think everybody will probably say exactly the same thing. If they sign him, it'll answer a lot of questions.
And then just to finish off with a few questions from our listeners, we've got Callback of the Net sent a question to say, why, in his opinion, does Steve Bruce seemingly have no plan or intent to develop young players? He mentions the Longstaff brothers, he lists Anderson, and he also lists Lewis.
Well, I think to be fair to him, he did give players a chance last season. I think the Elliot Anderson situation was an interesting one. He was under a lot of pressure at the time. If Elliot Anderson goes away to Luton or wherever he was going and plays well, the pressure then is on him, because he looks like he's allowed a player to go who should have been playing in the first team. So I think that, the pressure was on them then not to loan him out, because they were like, look, we'll give him a few chances here, but they have to have a plan for Elliot Anderson in the summer. Matty Longstaff, I think he's got to go. I think he's got to leave to get where he wants to be. Clearly, he doesn't fancy him for whatever reason. I don't know whether whether there's been a fallout there or whether there's been a bust up, but he doesn't fancy him. So I think Longstaff's got to go. But I think, you say about young players there, he had a plan to develop Willock. So, it's I think the problem with in the Premier League is you could argue the same of Rafa Benitez, because he only played Sean Longstaff when he had to. They are, especially at Newcastle, they're under so much pressure to get results to keep them in the Premier League. But really, in terms of developing young players, it's not difficult. If the player's good enough, then they play. And he's not the only one, he's not the only one in that situation. But they've got to have a plan with Elliot Anderson, because he's got to do one. They've got to have a plan with Freddie Woodman as well, by the way. Obviously not played for Newcastle this season, but they've got to have a good plan in place for both of them, because they're two fine players, especially with Woodman. They don't want to lose him for nothing.
It's ironic, isn't it? Because Woodman's very much in the position of Willock. He can come back to his parent club and demand to know what's going to happen, demand some guarantees, perhaps. Stephen Locke asks, what will the figure for the transfer budget be, in your opinion, Mark? And any of the names that we've seen linked so far, so the likes of the Celtic defender, you mentioned the Wigan striker as well. Is that interest genuine, and how likely do you think they are to sign for Newcastle?
Well, Ajer's definitely one that they're interested in. I think he's got massive potential to be, a really good defender. I think they'll have to sell players to come up with a really big transfer budget. What will happen? I wrote a piece about it in the week. I think with Willock, they don't really have a transfer budget. It's very much a case by case basis. So I think it may be that Mike Ashley sort of says, "Yeah, I like the look of Willock. Go and try and do the deal." And Ajer maybe comes in as well. But the noises from people around it seem to be that there's not a lot of money there. But I think what they'll look to do is sign one or two quality players rather than bringing in a lot. And then he's got loans as well. But yeah, the names are genuine. What's interesting is that Bruce probably wants a different caliber of player, but he hasn't necessarily got the green light for that yet. So it's an interesting one, isn't it? I think there isn't so much a budget. It's more of a case by case. If Mike Ashley says yes, you can go and get him, then go and get him, and that's pretty much the way it is. So we'll have to wait and see what the intent is. But if he thinks the takeover is likely to happen, he might not spend anything. But that's where Bruce and Ashley's relationship, which we're told is quite strong, is important, isn't it? He needs to show him that he does back him, because Bruce will be under pressure. And if he's not got Joe Willock, the team are significantly weaker than they were at the end of the season.
Yes, I know. Will Jethro Williams be a Newcastle player come the start of the season?
I'm going to do a bit more digging on it, but I don't think so. No, I don't think so. I don't think he'll get the points that he needs from the GBE, the Brexit things. But there could be a special dispensation in there. It's whether Newcastle want to go and get him. We'll be doing a bit more digging on it anyway. I think it's not beyond the realms of possibility, but I think it's unlikely.
And just finally, then, I think this is a really good question here from Jay Action. You kind of alluded to it earlier on the show, Mark. And he says, what do you think the club will do in their attempt to attract back the 10,000 fans? He's obviously referencing the season tickets that they gave out before the pandemic struck, and the fact that it took a lot longer maybe to sell those tickets against Sheffield United than maybe the club thought. So what will they do to try and get them fans back in next season?
Well, I think they'll set it as we've backed the manager to get those players, the Wilsons and that last year, and you would think they'll try and sign some players this summer and talk about how they're going to aim to have a better season than they did last year. But I mean, that's always been the argument, isn't it, with Newcastle? It's like they don't sell it well enough. They think they can't win, so they don't try. And my argument would be, if you don't try, then you'll never know. So I think they need to. I think they need to do something. They need to do something. Whether they will or not, I don't know. They've certainly not shown any inclination so far to kind of make, to put a message out there. But we'll see. It's a rare one, isn't it, where you've got a situation like that, and there's so much uncertainty around whether there will be full stadiums next season or not, that I don't think they'll be too worried about it. I'd be surprised if they put season tickets on sale the whole summer, and until we know, probably June the 21st, until we know what things are going to look like after that. Nobody's going to really do too much. So it'll be mothballed like a lot of things with Newcastle United. It'll be a can kick down the road.
Well, that's it. That's the end of Mark Douglas's season review. To you guys listening, please remember to like and subscribe to the Everything is Black and White podcast on your podcast provider. And for those watching on YouTube, do the same as well. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom there. We do appreciate it, and enjoy the off season. Enjoy the Euro Championships as well. And like I say, I'll be back shortly with Lee Ryder and John Gibson later in the month to get their take on the 2020-21 campaign.